My name is Cecilia, and I am the media coordinator at IATP. And with me today, I have Sharon Treat, our senior attorney, who's here to continue a series of conversations we've been having about trade deals that are currently underway despite COVID-19. So Sharon, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself to our audience who might not have met you on these Facebook Live sessions yet.
Sure, I'm Sharon Treat, as Cecilia said. I'm senior attorney at IATP. I'm working on a whole range of trade agreements and also some domestic policy around toxic chemicals in agriculture. And yeah, I'm looking forward to having the conversation today.
Wonderful. So throughout our conversation, please feel free to leave any questions or comments you have in the comment section. And at the end of our talk, Sharon will turn to your questions and address those at the end. So like I mentioned, this is the second in a series of conversations we've been having about current trade deals underway between the United States and other countries. A few weeks ago, we had you on here to discuss a potential mini trade deal between the US and the EU. Today, we're going to talk about a second set of negotiations underway between the United States and the United Kingdom. So when the United Kingdom officially leaves the European Union, it will need to craft its own trade and investment policies and will likely be looking to enter into trade agreements with other countries. So can you tell us what is in the works right now between the United States and the United Kingdom?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually negotiations going on this very week. It's a second round of negotiations between the United Kingdom and the US. Okay. And there were preliminary talks some time ago that weren't formal. They had to be done in an informal way before the final Brexit decisions were made. Mm-hmm. The US is looking for a trade agreement that's very broad in scope, that includes over 30 chapters like the new NAFTA, a USMCA. Mm-hmm. And Britain has also said it wants something similar, very broad in scope. I think one of the things about this that is concerning in a way to me, and I think to other people who are in the UK right now, is the government is trying to do this at the same time that it's negotiating with the European Union. It hasn't actually figured out its relationship with the European Union going forward, and is looking to negotiate this trade deal as well as other ones all at the same time. And then it's also sort of developing domestic policies that it hasn't had to have in its own laws before all at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a little long, and it's being done on very fast timetable, which is always a concern.
Yes. Yeah. So it's moving quickly. Is there much transparency about this negotiation? Like, do we know what happened in those initial first rounds of conversation and now what's happening now this week?
Yeah, we know a little bit. I mean, there's no transparency, but we do know a little bit about what the governments want, because first there were these preliminary talks where there were leaked documents that showed that some of the things that the US really wanted, for example, was to kind of stop the United Kingdom from having more labeling on foods. That was something they said, we don't like that. It's bad. It doesn't do any good. So, that's the kind of thing. And there's also like negotiating, objectives that both countries have published. The US has been pretty clear that, like, let's just talk about food standards and agriculture. It wants to do things that would make it easier to have GMOs, both in the supermarket, but also products that are grown in agriculture, for example. It would like to look at basing policies not on the precautionary principle, but on what the US calls a risk-based principle, which generally in the US has led to less regulation of pesticides and consumer products. So there's a whole long list of things that the US says it wants. And on the UK side, and certainly selling a lot of agricultural products that currently aren't allowed in the United Kingdom because of the policies that the UK has, which are based on EU law and that prohibit a lot of these products.
Okay, so the US does have a long list of objectives that they hope to get out of this deal. What about, you might have mentioned it, has the UK published a similar list of negotiating objectives?
Yeah, it has a very fat document, but there's a lot of it doesn't really say specifically whether or not they would agree to some of these things that the US has put forward. I mean, clearly they would like to be able to sell more of their products and to sell them without tariffs. And that's usually an objective of a free trade agreement. It's really unclear, though. It seems like it's a bit of an unbalanced negotiation, and it might be that the United States has a lot more to benefit from in terms of being able to sell more products into the UK than the other way around. And that would be a concern about this agreement from the point of view, certainly, of people in the UK.
Definitely. What is the current trade relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom? Do we already export, or does the United Kingdom already export a lot into the United States?
Yeah, I mean, the US is actually the second biggest trading partner with the UK after the European Union, which is certainly the biggest. But that is without having any kind of free trade agreement with the United States. So I think one thing to make clear is that it's not necessary to have a big 30-chapter free trade agreement in order to have a lot of trade. And one of the concerns that certainly I have about this kind of agreement is that the vast majority of the chapters actually relate to changing or affecting the shape of domestic laws and policies, as opposed to specifically relating to trade. So they go into trying to change, the intellectual property rules, or to change, how you regulate pesticides, or what your chemical policies are, or whether or not to, douse chicken in say chlorine washes, as opposed to having more of a farm to fork policy. I mean, this is what a lot of the trade agreement is about, as opposed to provisions that say we'll have tariffs or we won't have tariffs on these products.
Okay, I get it. All right. So a few months back, you wrote an article on our website, and that was titled "Standards at Stake, U.S.-U.K. Trade Deal Risks Lower Food Standards." And you just kind of mentioned some of those lower standards that we have here in the United States that then would be forced upon the United Kingdom if this deal were to move forward. In that article, you discussed the consequences of regulatory cooperation. Could you just explain the concept of regulatory cooperation for those who might not be familiar with it?
Sure. I mean, you have a trade agreement that has a whole lot written in it. In fact, these can be hundreds of pages. So there's lots and lots of rules in these trade agreements. But the idea of regulatory cooperation is that this trade agreement is sort of a living agreement that goes on over time, and that regulators can get together across sort of country borders and discuss how to make the regulations more similar going forward, particularly as, times change, or you want to, say, start to regulate some other kind of chemicals that are newly on the market. And some of the concern about that is just like the trade negotiation process itself, which is very secretive. We don't really know who's at the table. We don't know what they're talking about. They don't share text. That kind of thing can also go on in a regulatory cooperation context. And even though we don't have that much experience with it, because it's kind of a newer approach to free trade, putting something like this in a free trade agreement, we do know from what's been going on between the European Union and Canada, which also has a regulatory cooperation provision, that there's been a lot of pressure on the Europeans to basically lower their standards to be similar to the Canadians, so the Canadians can export more of these agricultural products that I just talked about that don't meet EU standards. So it's a very similar situation with the US and UK. And so the fear is that there would be the same kind of pressure going on, again, behind closed doors, to lower standards.
Yeah. Who would be most impacted by the lowering of these standards? Would it be consumers or farmers themselves?
Well, I think it could be everyone. I mean, consumers potentially would be getting products that don't meet the same high standards that they're used to right now. And in fact, the UK government has proposed allowing, there was another leaked memo, so it's non-transparent, but then there's a lot of leaks apparently in the UK. But anyway, the UK government has proposed, well, we could allow these products that don't meet our standards, like, for example, animal welfare standards, onto the UK market, but there would be higher tariffs for those. Well, it still puts things on the market. And then the concern for farmers is, even if there were these higher tariffs, they would be basically held to a different standard than the United States farmers. And of course, the US has huge agribusiness operations that operate these sort of industrial factory farms. And it's a way of agriculture that actually IETP has worked hard to sort of come up with alternatives to, and to really not necessarily be promoting, but to focus on what's bad about it. And here you have a trade agreement that is just sort of exporting that style of farming and those kinds of products to another country.
So I think when the UK released its negotiating objectives back in March, they stated, without exception, all food imports into the United Kingdom will meet our stringent food safety standards. How likely is that actually to be, given the conversation we've just had?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was skeptical when I read that, and now I'm really skeptical because you have the UK government actually negating its own point by saying, well, we would let these things in maybe, or at least we'll talk to the US about that. That's what it was. It was like they would potentially be bringing this idea forward to the US. And certainly on the US side, just last week, the US Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, said, we won't enter into an agreement with the UK unless our agricultural products have free access, and that means getting rid of these kinds of standards that we think are really bad and not based on science. So they've been very clear that their primary goal is to actually change the UK standards, or at least allow products onto the market without directly changing the standards that still don't meet those standards. So like, why have them, right? I mean, it definitely, the ultimate consequences of it is that it is going to change those standards, and that people are buying things in the stores that don't meet them.
Yes. Okay. So switching gears a little bit, we've mentioned, that these negotiations have been going on despite the fact that we're in the midst of a global health crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic. Beyond the fact that these negotiations might be impeding a response to that global pandemic and health crisis, would there be any other public health implications of this deal?
Yeah, I think potentially there are quite a few. I actually was giving a talk last week with a group of public health officers and activists in the UK. And, there's some things that are sort of more directly focused on providing healthcare, like cost of prescription drugs, which there certainly would be a push in a US agreement to actually put provisions into the trade agreement that would cause prescription drug prices to go up in the UK, which would certainly, limit access and certainly, increase the cost of healthcare. So that's one aspect. But then also from a public health perspective, there's a lot of measures out there. I mentioned labeling. That's a key measure to address, say, obesity. When you have labeling that shows that, this product is really high in fat or sugar, and that, this product over here is less, so maybe you could buy that other product. That's actually a very effective public health measure. But the US is very strongly opposed to that, tried to put in a whole section in the USMCA that would have pretty much prohibited really good, clear labeling. And we do know that the UK has, both the government and consumer groups have been talking about moving to a more mandatory labeling process for foods. And so, and that of course covers other things too. I mean, there's issues around like alcohol labeling or tobacco labeling. These are all key public health strategies. And then I did mention also just pesticides. I mean, there's a vast difference between the EU, what the EU allows, and what the US allows, both in terms of pesticide residues, so how much you get for some pesticide that's allowed, but also the US allows like over 80 pesticides that have been banned or are being phased out in the European Union as being unsafe for public health. So that's a whole nother kind of public health aspect of what a trade agreement could lead to.
So have any public health groups or consumer groups pushed back against what is listed out in these objectives and these negotiations? It seems like there would be a lot for groups to be concerned about the potential of this deal.
Yeah, there is a lot. And actually, the groups in the UK, there's a whole coalition of organizations that have been working together to try to find out more and share information. So just last week, again, there was a report that came out from Pesticide Action Network UK and Sustain UK, which details, that, like, for example, with grapes, that there is some chemicals, pesticides that were allowed like 1,000 times the residue level on a grape in the US than would be allowed in the EU. And just interestingly enough, I was watching this hearing again with Ambassador Lighthizer, who said he actually brought up this issue about EU standards not allowing pesticide residue on foods, and saying that that's just unacceptable and unscientific. And in fact, it's actually protective, because these are pesticides that are banned in the EU. And if you were to allow all this food in with residue of this banned pesticide, it's not safe.
Yeah.
And it completely undermines their domestic laws. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of concern, and that's just one issue. There's been a lot of interest around the issues around U.S. meat, which is often processed with chemicals, as I've mentioned, but also grown. You've got pork that's grown with these different drugs, ractopamine, carbidox, that have health implications that are actually banned in other countries, including the UK. So again, these are things that the public is quite aware of and quite interested in.
Yes. So you mentioned earlier that free trade deals are not needed because we already have trade relationships with the United Kingdom. So what would ITP's recommendation be as an alternative to this potential deal?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can have trade without a free trade agreement, and you can also have narrow free trade agreements that don't include 34 chapters that basically are about changing another country's domestic laws, so you could focus an agreement that was working more on a cooperative level. I mean, let's take the health issue. The US should be really working internationally to develop vaccines and treatments for COVID, right? As opposed to withdrawing our money from the WTO and saying that we're going to try to outbid other countries to get it all for ourselves and nobody else. I mean, there are other ways of working internationally, particularly in the health field, that I think are much they're more moral, as well as being a better way to go. And certainly coming up with policies that promote sustainability as to instead of promoting policies and practices that are both unsustainable in terms of agriculture or the climate, and don't necessarily lead to good food. That's not the best approach. So we should be going to the highest standard, not kind of dumbing down to the lowest common denominator in these trade agreements.
That's great. So Sharon, before I turn to the questions from our viewers, is there anything else about this trade deal that you think is important for our audience to know today?
Well, the main thing I would say is that this seems to be negotiated on such a speedy timetable from both the US side and the UK side that it doesn't provide time enough for civil society and public to know what is going on in these agreements. And there's huge potential for a very bad deal. So from my perspective, it makes a lot of sense to step back from this and take some time to think about what people really want in a trade deal and enable them to participate and try to get a little more transparency about what's happening and less secrecy, so that it's a more democratic process that involves the public and public interest stakeholders going forward.
Thank you.